In the shattered ruins of post-war Europe, as the guns fell silent and nations began to mourn, an invisible war raged beneath the surface, one built not on tanks or aircraft, but on forged papers, whispered names, and silent departures in the dead of night. The world had just witnessed the fall of one of history's most brutal regimes, but for the architects of that cruelty, the story was far from over. These men, high-ranking officers of the SS, Gestapo masterminds, death camp commanders, knew the gallows awaited them. Yet instead of facing judgment in courtrooms like those in Nuremberg, many simply vanished. Not into oblivion, but into new lives, often under new identities, thanks to an underground escape network known as the Ratlines. The term Ratlines evokes images of vermin fleeing a sinking ship, and that is exactly what it was. In the chaos of Germany's defeat, a maze of clandestine routes emerged across the continent. These pathways crisscrossed mountains and borders, moving fugitives from Allied-occupied zones into the relative safety of neutral or sympathetic territories. But the most disturbing part was not the existence of these networks, it was who helped build them. Behind these operations were not only former Nazi collaborators, but also institutions once seen as beacons of morality and neutrality. Elements within the Vatican offered spiritual cover and shelter, cloaking fugitives in the garments of redemption. The International Red Cross, overwhelmed and under-scrutinized, unwittingly issued travel documents that allowed war criminals to board ships and airplanes with clean records and fresh names. It was through these channels that men responsible for genocide and torture escaped justice entirely. Argentina became the crown jewel of Nazi exile. Under the leadership of Juan Perón, the country opened its doors to hundreds of former Nazis, some of whom took up quiet lives as farmers, engineers, or bureaucrats. Others found refuge in Syria and Egypt, where anti-Western sentiment and emerging Cold War alliances made them useful assets in military and intelligence circles. These escapes were not accidental. They were calculated, deliberate, and often carried out with chilling efficiency. Entire new lives were constructed, complete with jobs, families, and state protection. In cities like Buenos Aires and Damascus, former SS officers strolled through marketplaces and dined in cafes as if the horrors they had overseen belonged to another lifetime. And the world, it moved on. With the Iron Curtain descending over Europe and Cold War tensions rising, priorities shifted. Justice became negotiable. Truth became inconvenient. But not everyone was willing to let the past slip away. As the Ratlines operated in secret, a counterforce began to stir, one that sought truth, remembrance, and accountability. For every fugitive hiding behind a false name, someone was searching, compiling records, and refusing to forget. Because the war may have ended, but history was still watching. This is the story of how they fled, of who let them go, and of the relentless pursuit that followed. In the years following the war, as Europe began stitching its shattered cities back together, a different kind of battle quietly unfolded. It was not fought with bullets or bombs, but with ledgers, photographs, whispers, and stubborn memory. It was waged by a man who had no weapons, no army, and no state behind him. Just pain, just purpose. His name was Simon Wiesenthal. You have just heard how countless Nazi officials, men responsible for the most horrific crimes in modern history, escaped justice by slipping through the cracks of a crumbling post-war order. They ran through the Ratlines, shielded by falsified identities, Red Cross travel documents, and the complicity or silence of powerful institutions. They vanished into the haze of South America or the desert winds of the Middle East. And for a time it seemed like they had gotten away with it. But Simon Wiesenthal refused to let that be the end of the story. He was not a soldier anymore. The war had taken that from him. The Nazis had taken nearly everything else, his freedom, his family, and over 89 relatives who never came back. He had survived the camps, barely. And when the gates of Mauthausen were opened by American troops in May 1945, Wiesenthal weighed less than 100 pounds. He was broken in body, but not in spirit. Some survivors wanted to forget. Wiesenthal wanted to remember. not just for himself, but for the millions who could not. So while the world turned its attention to rebuilding economies and drawing Cold War battle lines, Wiesenthal sat at a small desk in a refugee camp with a pencil and a file folder. He began writing names, faces, places. He began collecting fragments, newspaper clippings, survivor testimonies. Rumors passed from one survivor to another like sacred relics. He understood something very few people did at the time, that if the world did not chase these men now, it might never chase them at all. One name haunted him more than any other, Adolf Eichmann. To many outside of Europe, Eichmann was just another footnote in the Nazi command chain. But to those who truly knew the mechanics of genocide, Eichmann was no minor figure. He was the engineer, the logistical brain behind the machinery of mass murder. He designed the train schedules that sent millions to their deaths, counted cattle cars like inventory, and perfected a system where murder became administrative. After the war, Eichmann disappeared, last seen in 1946, rumored to be dead. But Wiesenthal did not believe it. Years passed. Countries stopped asking questions. Even Israel, struggling with its own survival in the Middle East, had other priorities. But Wiesenthal kept digging. In 1953, he got a tip, just a whisper, a detail buried in a letter that Eichmann might be alive in Argentina under an assumed name. It was a needle in a haystack. But Wiesenthal had become an expert in finding needles. He contacted intelligence agencies. He scoured visa records. He cross-referenced obscure German surnames in Argentine directories. The world told him to move on. But he had never been more certain Eichmann was alive. And Eichmann had to face judgment. By 1959, Wiesenthal's files helped Israeli Mossad agents narrow down their search. One evening in May 1960, on a quiet street in Buenos Aires, they found him. Adolf Eichmann, living under the name Ricardo Clement, walked home from work and was bundled into a car by Mossad operatives. Within days, he was en route to Israel, drugged and bound on a flight that would change history. The trial that followed gripped the world. For the first time, survivors took the stand to tell their stories, not just of suffering, but of witnessing. The Holocaust was no longer just a distant horror. It had a face, a courtroom, a reckoning. And sitting in the back, often unnoticed, was Simon Wiesenthal, the man who would not forget. He was not interested in revenge. He did not believe in it. He believed in justice, not the kind shouted from angry crowds, but the kind that came slowly, deliberately, inside courtrooms, with judges and evidence. Justice for me is not a personal thing, he once said. It is not vengeance. It is education. That trial was only the beginning. Over the next 4 decades, Wiesenthal continued his relentless pursuit, helping locate and expose over 1,100 Nazi fugitives. He tracked war criminals to Bolivia, to Austria, to Canada. Some were tried. Some died in hiding. Others were unrepentant to the end. But because of Wiesenthal, they were never truly invisible again. And what did he get for all of it? Death threats, political backlash, even accusations of obsession. But Wiesenthal never stopped, because he understood what many still struggle to accept, that forgetting is the first step to repeating. That memory, no matter how painful, is a form of resistance. He once said, "Survival is a privilege which entails obligations. I am forever asking myself what I can do for those who did not survive." The answer I found for myself was, I want to bring the perpetrators to justice. So if you are watching this now, wondering why it matters, why this chapter of history still deserves your attention, this is why. Because men like Eichmann nearly got away with it, because systems of power were willing to look the other way. Because memory is fragile, and if not defended, it dies. Simon Wiesenthal built his legacy not with power, but with perseverance. In a world quick to forget, he chose to remember for all of us. While Simon Wiesenthal hunted fugitives in the shadows, refusing to let the ghosts of the Holocaust slip quietly into oblivion, another battle for justice unfolded in full view of the world. This one did not take place in back alleys or safe houses. It took place in a courtroom beneath the shattered roofs of post-war Germany. It began in a city still smoldering with the memory of Hitler's fiery speeches and ended with a reckoning unlike anything the world had ever seen. The year was 1945. Nazi Germany had surrendered. The world had emerged from the deadliest conflict in human history, numb with horror. Cities were ruins. Families were broken. Millions were dead. But amid the ashes, the Allies agreed on one thing. Someone had to answer for what had happened. There could be no healing without truth, no peace without justice. And so, in the bombed-out city of Nuremberg, once the symbolic heart of the Nazi Party, an international tribunal was convened. 4 nations stood united: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Together, they summoned 24 of the most powerful surviving leaders of the Third Reich. They sat in the dock under heavy guard. Generals, ministers, ideologues, men who had signed the orders, planned the invasions, and engineered the mass killings. But this was not to be a show trial or a public spectacle. It was something far more ambitious, a new kind of justice. For the first time in history, a court would hold a government accountable not just for crimes against other nations, but for crimes against humanity itself. The Nuremberg Trials lasted from November 1945 to October 1946. Over 200 days of proceedings, the courtroom echoed with evidence of atrocity, photographs, documents, films, and survivor testimonies that made even hardened prosecutors weep. The scale was staggering: the Holocaust, the invasions, the slave labor, the medical experiments, the political executions, the looting of entire countries. And yet, even with the weight of unspeakable horror hanging over the proceedings, the trials were scrupulously fair. Each defendant had the right to legal counsel. Each was presumed innocent until proven guilty. The judges adhered to rules of procedure, because if justice was to be real, it had to be better than what the Nazis had offered their victims. One by one, the crimes were laid bare. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's right-hand man, sneered in defiance. Rudolf Hess, the former deputy Führer, sat silent and glassy-eyed. Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had helped orchestrate the invasion of Poland, squirmed as his diplomatic lies unraveled. Some tried to blame Hitler. Others claimed they were only following orders. But the evidence was overwhelming. The lead American prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, delivered one of the most powerful statements in legal history. "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish," he said, "have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored. The record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow." It was more than a trial. It was a mirror held up not just to Germany, but to the entire world. And from this crucible of testimony and law came something extraordinary: the foundations of modern human rights. The Nuremberg Trials established that individuals, even heads of state, could be held personally responsible for war crimes, that just following orders was no defense against barbarity, that genocide, slavery, and systemic cruelty were not national policies, they were crimes. Crimes that could never again be allowed to hide behind flags or uniforms. From this moment emerged the Nuremberg Principles, a set of legal standards that still guide international law today. And from the medical horrors exposed during the trial came the Nuremberg Code, which set the foundation for modern bioethics and human experimentation guidelines. But not everyone was punished. Of the 24 men in the dock, 12 were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. A few were acquitted. And many others, thousands of mid and lower ranking perpetrators, escaped entirely, vanishing into the same Ratlines that Simon Wiesenthal would later chase across continents. Still, the Nuremberg trials mattered, not because they caught everyone, but because they proved it could be done, that even the most powerful could be dragged from the shadows and forced to face the consequences of their actions, that justice, even if imperfect, was not impossible. For Wiesenthal and others who would spend their lives pursuing accountability, Nuremberg was not the end. It was the beginning, a legal precedent, a moral compass, A warning. The tribunal had shown the world what justice could look like when the rule of law was given a voice. It had reminded humanity of its own capacity for reason, even after descending into madness. And it raised a question that would echo through the decades to come. If justice could be done in Nuremberg, why not in Buenos Aires, in Cairo, in Damascus? Why not everywhere? Because the Nuremberg Trials were not just about the past. They were about the future. About drawing a line in the sand and daring the world to remember. About ensuring that even when war criminals wore suits and smiled at cameras, their crimes would follow them. Across oceans. Across decades. Justice, after all, has a long memory. And Simon Wiesenthal, he never forgot. As the echoes of the Nuremberg trials faded and the headlines turned from justice to geopolitics, a chilling shift began to take root, a quiet, calculated pivot from moral clarity to strategic compromise. The war was over, yes. The camps had been liberated, the trials held, the gallows used. But another kind of war had already begun, one fought not with tanks or tribunals, but with blueprints, rockets, and ideologies. And in this new Cold War, the lines between right and wrong blurred faster than anyone was ready to admit. America, the self-declared victor of moral justice, found itself facing a new threat. The Soviet Union, the two former allies, bound briefly by necessity, were now locked in a tense, ideological standoff. The battlegrounds would be Korea, Berlin, and eventually the moon. But the weapons of choice would come not from generals or soldiers, but from scientists. And that is where the story takes a disturbing turn. Because some of the brightest scientific minds in the world did not belong to the Allies. They belonged to the defeated. To Germany, to men who had built the V-2 rockets that rained death on London. To engineers who had designed weapons of terror inside underground factories staffed by slave labor. To scientists who, during the war, had worn SS uniforms, posed for photos with Himmler, and pledged allegiance to Adolf Hitler, and yet, instead of prison cells, they were offered something else, jobs. This was Operation Paperclip, a secret program authorized by President Harry Truman in 1945, just months after the end of World War II. Its mission, to bring over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. Officially, the policy was clear. No one with Nazi affiliations or war crimes involvement would be included. But in practice, that line was easy to erase, and often was. Among these men was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant aerospace engineer and the mastermind behind Germany's V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. During the war, the V-2 had been a terrifying symbol of Nazi technological might, killing thousands in England, Belgium, and France. Its production involved brutal forced labor from concentration camp prisoners. Thousands died in the underground factories where the rockets were built. Von Braun knew. He visited the camps. He walked those tunnels. But after the war, with his knowledge too valuable to ignore, the U.S. swept his past under the rug. Within a few short years, he was no longer a war criminal. He was a pioneer, a visionary, a VIP guest on American television shows, smiling beside generals and presidents. The man who once worked for Hitler was now working for NASA, and he was not alone. Scientists with SS ranks, those who had overseen weapons programs, even those accused of conducting unethical human experiments, all found sanctuary under Operation Paperclip. Many became instrumental in the development of American military technology, space exploration, and Cold War defense systems. To the public, they were simply German experts. Their pasts were often sanitized, hidden, or classified. The justification was simple. If we did not take them, the Soviets would. And in a world now split between East and West, between freedom and communism, that was a risk the U.S. was not willing to take. But what was the cost? The decision to prioritize scientific progress over justice raised profound ethical questions that haunted survivors like Simon Wiesenthal, while Wiesenthal hunted men across continents. Demanding accountability for the Holocaust His own government had quietly embraced others like them, not out of forgiveness, but out of fear. The message was subtle, but devastating. Some crimes could be overlooked, so long as they were useful. It is hard to reconcile the images. On one side of the world, Eichmann sat in a glass box in Jerusalem, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. On the other, von Braun stood on a NASA launch pad in Florida, watching the future of American spaceflight ascend into the sky. One man was held to account, the other was celebrated, and yet both had been part of the same machine. To be clear, not every scientist in Operation Paperclip was a war criminal. Some had joined the Nazi Party out of fear or career necessity. Others were apolitical, more focused on formulas than Führers. But the truth remains, many were not innocent. Many had seen, enabled, or even orchestrated the horrors of the Nazi regime, and the U.S. government made a choice to look the other way. Operation Paperclip was a Faustian bargain. It gave America a technological edge that helped win the space race and build modern aerospace infrastructure. But it also compromised the very ideals the country claimed to uphold. For every rocket launched, there was a buried file. For every scientific breakthrough, a moral blind spot. It forced a question that still lingers. What do we sacrifice in the name of progress? How much of our soul can we trade before we lose sight of who we are? As we look back on this chapter today, it is easy to marvel at the accomplishments, satellites, space shuttles, moon landings. But history is more complicated than a highlight reel. And justice, as Simon Wiesenthal knew, is not just about trials and verdicts. It is about truth. Because when we choose silence over accountability, we do not just rewrite history. We risk repeating it. And in the long shadow of war, even rockets leave ghosts. In the chaotic aftermath of World War II, Germany lay in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its people reeling from defeat, and its institutions morally bankrupt. The world looked at the Third Reich's horrifying legacy and asked one burning question: how do you rebuild a nation that had embraced such evil? How do you start again when the very foundations, its schools, its courts, its culture, had been soaked in fascism? The answer for the Allies was something called denazification. On paper, it was a bold, uncompromising mission. The goal: to strip Germany clean of Nazi influence. Every member of the Nazi Party, every propagandist, every SS officer would be identified, interrogated, and barred from public life. The process would reach into every corner of society: politics, education, the judiciary, media, even business. No one was above scrutiny. No Nazi ideology, no matter how subtle, would survive. But as with so many things in post-war Europe, reality proved far messier than idealism. At first, the efforts were intense. Millions of Germans were required to fill out detailed questionnaires, Fragebogen, that asked about party affiliations, wartime activities, and personal relationships. Allied officials reviewed these documents, attempting to categorize individuals as major offenders, lesser offenders, or followers. Trials were held, public figures were removed, teachers were fired, books were banned, statues were torn down, Nazi imagery was erased from the streets. But this sweeping effort quickly collided with a harsh truth. Germany needed to function. The war had not just destroyed infrastructure, it had also wiped out the leadership class. And many of those who knew how to run a factory, manage a school, or organize a local government had, at some point, joined the Nazi Party. Some out of conviction, others out of convenience. But either way, they were everywhere. Purging them all meant paralyzing the country. And as the Cold War intensified, that became a risk the Western Allies were no longer willing to take. The United States, in particular, grew increasingly anxious about the Soviet Union's growing influence in Eastern Europe. The new objective was no longer just justice, it was stability. And to build a stable, capitalist West Germany that could stand as a bulwark against communism, pragmatism began to win over principle. The result: a quiet, often unspoken reversal. Former Nazis, some of whom had been removed just months earlier, were quietly reinstated. Bureaucrats re-entered government. Judges returned to courtrooms. Educators went back to classrooms. Businessmen regained their influence. Entire ministries were restaffed with men who had once marched under the swastika. The process that had begun as a moral cleansing became a bureaucratic shuffle. One telling example was Hans Globke, a senior legal advisor who had helped draft the infamous Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of their rights. In the 1950s, Globke became chief of staff to West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. That is right. The man who helped codify racial persecution became one of the most powerful men in West Germany's new democratic government. And he was not alone. In fact, by the early 1950s, fewer than 200 Nazis remained incarcerated for war crimes. Of the thousands implicated in the Holocaust and other atrocities, most had simply slipped back into everyday life unchallenged, unpunished. Some even rose to prominence again. The very people Simon Wiesenthal was chasing across continents were sometimes dining in the same cafes as local politicians. For Wiesenthal and others committed to justice, this quiet reintegration was infuriating. How could a country truly move forward, they asked, if it had not come to terms with its past? How could democracy take root in soil that had never been cleared of its fascist weeds? But not everyone was ignoring the past. Some German survivors, activists, young people began to push back. They demanded education, transparency, and acknowledgement. They asked uncomfortable questions of their parents, their teachers, their judges. They wanted to know what had happened in those years, and why no one was talking about it. Meanwhile, the Allied approach to denazification remained uneven. In the British zone, the focus gradually shifted from punishment to rebuilding civil society. In the French zone, a harsher stance lingered a bit longer. In the American zone, where the process had initially been strict, leniency soon took hold, especially after the CIA and military began recruiting former Nazis for intelligence operations against the Soviets. The Soviet zone, ironically, launched its own version of denazification, but often used it as a political tool, purging not only Nazis, but also political opponents and social democrats. By the late 1940s, the East German regime was declaring itself anti-fascist, even as it incorporated former Nazis into its own state apparatus under a different banner. All of this created a landscape of deep contradictions. On one hand, Germany held memorials, apologized, taught Holocaust history. On the other, its institutions were, in part, rebuilt by the very people who had once enabled the atrocities. And for many families of the victims, that contradiction cut deep. They had watched the trials, they had seen justice delivered publicly, clearly, in places like Nuremberg, but they also knew that, outside the courtroom, justice had been quietly negotiated away, that behind the new face of German democracy were still old loyalties and hidden histories. It would take decades, generations, even before Germany truly began to reckon with that truth. Before politicians spoke openly about the failings of denazification, before children of perpetrators came forward with their own stories of inherited guilt and shame, before the silence finally began to break. So when we talk about the aftermath of the war, it is easy to focus on the dramatic moments, the trials, the captures, the courtroom verdicts, but there is another story, one that unfolds in the margins, in the quiet compromises made in the name of peace. Because justice, real justice, is not just about removing a flag or holding a trial. It is about the courage to keep asking, who got away, who helped them, and what does it say about us that we let them? They say evil hides in the shadows, but after World War II, some of it hid in plain sight within the very institutions the world trusted most, while the smoke from the crematoria still lingered in the memories of survivors. And while Simon Wiesenthal chased Nazi fugitives from South America to the Middle East, another story was quietly unfolding. One that complicates the narrative of post-war justice. One that forces us to ask, what happens when the very hands meant to heal become tools of escape? At the center of this controversy stood two of the world's most respected humanitarian institutions, the Vatican and the International Red Cross. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Europe was chaos. Borders were shattered. Cities had become refugee camps. Millions were displaced, stateless, hungry, desperate. Into this confusion stepped relief organizations, trying to bring order to the disorder, helping families reunite, distributing food, issuing papers, opening safe passage. But in this landscape of confusion and compassion, another type of refugee slipped through the hunted, high-ranking Nazis, SS officers, concentration camp doctors, collaborators, men like Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and Klaus Barbie found ways to disappear. They did not vanish into smoke. They traveled. They fled. And they did so using real documents, real train tickets, real Red Cross travel papers, often forged, sometimes authentic, but nearly always stamped with the unknowing complicity of humanitarian goodwill. The term for this network of escape, the Ratlines, were not a single route or a formal institution. They were a tangled web of safe houses, false identities, forged passports, sympathetic clergy, and bureaucratic loopholes. And at the heart of this web, time and time again, appeared connections, direct or indirect, to the Vatican and the Red Cross. Take, for instance, the case of Bishop Alois Hudal, a high-ranking Austrian clergyman based in Rome. Hudal was no anonymous priest. He was openly pro-German during the war and deeply sympathetic to former Nazis afterward. From his residence at the Collegio Teutonico, just steps from the Vatican, Hudal reportedly provided shelter, letters of recommendation, and spiritual cover to fleeing war criminals. It is alleged that he personally helped notorious figures like Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps, escape to South America. In his own writings, Hudal never expressed regret. Instead, he framed his actions as mercy, helping anti-communist refugees avoid what he saw as victor's justice. He did not deny the assistance, he justified it. And then there was the Red Cross, facing an impossible task. Millions of displaced people needed identification papers to cross borders. The Red Cross issued thousands of travel documents to stateless individuals, often based on minimal verification. The intention was noble, help refugees start over. But the system was vulnerable. Men like Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, walked into Red Cross offices using false names, sometimes with the help of Catholic priests, and walked out with official documents. With a stamped paper in hand, a former SS officer could board a train, book a passage to Argentina, and become a new man. The Red Cross has since acknowledged this lapse not out of malice, they have insisted, but out of systemic failure. There were too many people, too little oversight, and in many cases, too much trust in the word of those presenting themselves as refugees. But for victims of the Nazis and their families, this explanation did little to ease the sting, because every forged passport was not just a mistake. It was a life stolen from justice. It is important to say this. There is no conclusive evidence that the Vatican as an institution or the Red Cross as a whole intentionally aided Nazi escapes, but the patterns are difficult to ignore. Too many escapees found shelter in monasteries. Too many had documents issued from trusted organizations. Too many were aided by men in cassocks who spoke the language of forgiveness while sidestepping the demands of accountability. The consequences of these escapes rippled across decades. Josef Mengele, the angel of death, lived freely in South America for years, evading capture until his death. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, went on to work with foreign intelligence services before finally being extradited to France in the 1980s. These men should have stood in Nuremberg. Instead, they lived long, quiet lives, thanks in part to the papers, prayers, and protection that helped them vanish. And what of Simon Wiesenthal? What of the survivors? For them, these institutional failures were not abstract policy issues. They were personal betrayals. Survivors who had watched their families die were now watching their executioners live in sunny villas in Argentina. They were seeing the world move on while they still carried numbers on their arms and nightmares in their sleep. Wiesenthal once said, "Justice for crimes against humanity must not depend on time or convenience." But convenience, political, diplomatic, logistical, was often exactly what decided who got away and who faced trial. Today, both the Vatican and the Red Cross have taken steps to open their archives. They have acknowledged the role their systems may have played intentionally or not in helping war criminals escape. Historians continue to dig, uncover, debate. But the truth, however murky, is already written in the trails of the Ratlines, in the lives that were never brought to court, in the questions that still linger. Because history is not only shaped by those who commit atrocities, but also by those who look the other way. The war was lost, the flags burned, the statues toppled. But not all evils died with the fall of Berlin. When the Allies declared victory in 1945, it seemed like Nazism had been crushed militarily, politically, and morally. The world had seen the camps, the trials, the documents. It had heard the survivors, buried the dead, and condemned the regime that orchestrated such cruelty. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred, because ideologies do not die as easily as governments, and hatred has a way of adapting. In the shadows of post-war rubble, far from the courtrooms of Nuremberg, the seeds of neo-Nazism were already being planted. It did not happen overnight. In the 1940s and 50s, open admiration for Hitler was too dangerous, too fresh, too raw, but that did not stop whispers. In some homes, fathers told sons the Reich was not all bad. In certain towns, SS veterans gathered quietly to reminisce, not with shame, but with pride. And across Europe and the Americas, a network of sympathizers, exiles, and ideologues began to rewrite the story of the war, not as a tale of monstrous crime, but of lost glory. At first, it was fringe. Tabloid newspapers, underground pamphlets, secret clubs. But it did not stay that way. In Germany, neo-Nazi sentiments were suppressed by law, but never entirely eradicated. Former Nazis who had reintegrated into society, often with the quiet blessing of denazification efforts, carried their beliefs behind closed doors. Their children, sometimes confused, sometimes angry, inherited a strange silence about the past. Some rejected it, others embraced it. In the 1960s and 70s, as Germany reckoned with student protests and Cold War pressures, neo-Nazi groups began to reappear, donning new uniforms, speaking in new codes, but pushing the same poison. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, things were different but no less disturbing. In the wake of the war, American white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan found inspiration in Nazi propaganda. In 1959, George Lincoln Rockwell founded the American Nazi Party, complete with swastikas, salutes, and fiery speeches. He paraded through Washington, D.C., giving interviews, claiming Hitler had been right all along. He was mocked by many, but applauded by enough to grow a following. He called his movement pro-white, but his message was straight from the Third Reich: racial purity, anti-Semitism, authoritarian control. Then came the 1980s and 90s, economic downturns, urban unrest, rising immigration. These conditions fed the fires of resentment, giving neo-Nazi groups fertile ground. Skinheads, militia movements, and far-right paramilitaries used the Internet's early forums to spread their ideology, recruiting young men with promises of belonging and purpose, cloaked in nationalism. But perhaps nowhere did neo-Nazism find such fertile soil as in the post-Soviet states, especially Russia. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, it left behind not just economic devastation, but a spiritual vacuum. In the chaos of transition, millions of young Russians felt lost. They were told communism was dead, but what would replace it? Amid poverty, crime, and disillusionment, neo-Nazi groups emerged, offering not just identity, but scapegoats. Jews, immigrants, Muslims, the West. Groups like Russian National Unity, led by Alexander Barkashov, paraded through Moscow in military gear, arms raised in fascist salute. They mimicked the aesthetics of Hitler's Germany, from the symbols to the structure, yet cloaked themselves in Russian ultranationalism. Their rhetoric was violent, their actions more so. By the early 2000s, Russia had become a hub for some of the most militant neo-Nazi activity in the world, fueled by nationalism, economic despair, and unchecked bigotry. What is most chilling is how adaptable neo-Nazi ideology proved to be. While the original Nazis cloaked their crimes in science and racial theory, the new generation mixed their hate with conspiracy theories, modern political grievances, and even religious symbolism. The swastika was not always needed anymore. Sometimes it was hidden behind flags of patriotism, calls for traditional values, or coded language online. And through it all, the lessons of history began to blur. Holocaust denial, once a fringe belief, began to creep into mainstream discourse in some corners. Books, documentaries, and websites began to question the death toll, to downplay the atrocities, to portray Nazi Germany as a misunderstood power. In schools across the world, younger generations grew up further removed from the events of the 1940s, often with limited education about what really happened. For some, the swastika became just a symbol of rebellion, stripped of its blood-stained history. But survivors like Simon Wiesenthal never stopped warning. He understood better than anyone, forgetting is dangerous. The resurgence of neo-Nazism is not just about hate groups, it is about memory, about what we choose to teach, to remember, to confront. The moment we let history become hazy, ideology has room to creep back in. Not with tanks, but with tweets. Not with marches in Berlin, but with memes in Facebook comment sections. Not with jackboots, but with algorithms. And so, as we close the chapter on Nazi fugitives, on the Ratlines, on Nuremberg, and Operation Paperclip, we must ask, what is the true legacy? It is not just who was captured or escaped. It is not only about whether justice was done in 1945 or even in 1960. It is about now, because as long as neo-Nazi ideology persists, as long as people can still be radicalized by the same hatred that built the camps, then the war is not truly over. The danger remains. History does not just teach us what happened, it warns us what can happen again. They say time heals all wounds. But some wounds must be remembered because forgetting them would only reopen them in new, more dangerous ways. As we look back on this complex, painful, and often unsettling journey, from the fall of Nazi Germany to the hidden escape networks, from secret deals like Operation Paperclip to the troubling silence of institutions like the Vatican and the Red Cross, from the Nuremberg Trials to the failure of full denazification, and from neo-Nazi resurgence to the intergenerational legacy of guilt, the question is no longer just what happened. The real question is, what do we do with what we now know? Because the story is not over. Even today, nearly 80 years after World War II ended, the world is still reckoning with the consequences. There are still names on most wanted lists, aging war criminals who managed to vanish into history with new identities and silent neighbors. There are still legal battles over stolen art, as families and museums argue over what belongs to whom. There are still archives being opened, documents being unearthed, truth being pieced together. And there are still students learning about these horrors for the very first time, trying to understand how the world allowed it all to happen. Some people ask, why does this matter now? Why should we care about fugitives who are long dead, about stolen paintings gathering dust in galleries, about ideologies that seem too extreme, too absurd to ever take hold again? And here's why. Because it is already happening. We have seen it in the rise of extremist movements, in the normalization of hate speech, in the subtle rewriting of history to soften the crimes of the past, in the dangerous belief that it could not happen here. But history is not a straight line, it is a cycle, and if we do not learn from it, we are doomed to repeat it. That is why the work of people like Simon Wiesenthal still matters. He was not just hunting fugitives, he was preserving truth. He was fighting the idea that mass murderers could simply melt into the civilian life and be forgotten. His legacy reminds us that justice delayed can still be justice pursued, but only if we have the courage to keep looking. That is why institutions today continue to confront their own roles. Museums now invest in provenance research investigating the origins of artworks to determine if they were looted during the Nazi era. Some churches have issued public apologies for the actions or inactions of their predecessors. Even governments have begun revisiting Cold War policies that once prioritized power over principle, and that is why education is our greatest weapon. When we teach the Holocaust, we are not just recounting facts, we are inoculating the future against lies. When we talk about the Ratlines or Operation Paperclip, we are acknowledging that justice is complicated but still necessary. When we study the rise of neo-Nazism, we are warning against complacency. And when we remember the names Eichmann, Mengele, Barbie, we are not glorifying them but ensuring they are never mistaken for myths. So what can you do? You do not have to be a historian. You do not have to be a prosecutor or an activist. But you can start by simply not looking away. Ask questions. Read widely. Share real history, not just for clicks or shock value, but for understanding. Speak up when people distort the past to serve dangerous agendas. Support education that centers human rights and critical thinking. Visit memorials. Watch survivor testimonies. Talk to your children. Challenge the jokes, the symbols, the silence. And remember this: evil rarely arrives with a declaration. It seeps in quietly, wearing familiar faces. It thrives not just in violence, but in indifference. When we forget, it grows. When we excuse, it returns. When we minimize, it spreads. The story you have followed here of how Nazi leaders evaded justice, how institutions failed, how society struggled to move on, is not just about the past. It is a mirror, a warning, a call. Because history is never just what happened. It is what is still happening. In silence, in systems, in ideologies dressed in new clothes. And so, to you watching, listening, thinking, it is your turn. Be the witness, be the voice, be the generation that refuses to forget. Because justice is not only a verdict, it is a memory kept alive.